nothing left to lose. I'd barely managed to get the radio off and the door closed before I heard the infected moving in. Gunfire was still echoing out in the streets, but all I could do right now was to block the door with whatever I could. Only time would tell if this was going to be my crypt or my sanctuary. At least the bedside cabinet had something of use, beta blockers and vitamins. An unusual combination, but they'd serve me well in the days to come. It'd keep my mind calm and my energy levels high. Could only hope it could also take my mind off the constant gunshots ringing out. I'd already seen what would happen when panic set in, and the town was suffering for it. When I awoke a few hours later, at the sound of the infected scrabbling around in the room next door, my heart was racing. Still exhausted and now hungry, I wouldn't be leaving anytime soon. I needed to wait until the infected moved on. I tried to distract myself with the newspaper I'd brought with me. At the very least, once I was finished reading it, it wouldn't be a weight in my bag anymore. It did work though, my heart settling down as I skimmed through the various articles, followed by a handful of vitamins. Perhaps I was taking too many, but my body needed to relieve itself of the damage caused by the various days of stress. At this point though, the constant gunfire was almost becoming reassuring. It showed that the folk of West Point were constantly fighting on, and that they hadn't been driven off entirely, and perhaps they'd either win or lure the zombies away from my location. Slightly refreshed, I realised that turning the light off might increase my chances of not being spotted, and at the very least I would sleep better in the dark for now. Hearing thudding in the early hours of the morning, I crept out, initially intending just to turn the lights off, but it seemed a zombie had come in, and now was hammering at the door. Obviously he'd gotten in, still lured by the radio, only to be lured back outside again by the gunshots. I considered putting the bag down to use it axe two-handed, but if anything went wrong, I'd lose all my supplies. This was probably the right choice, as just as I was finishing inspecting the infected, another police officer came by, the source of the gunshots. She didn't even give me a chance to open the door before she smashed the window. She was obviously not going to take no for an answer, and frustratingly, had just lured all the infected towards my safe house. I was now on a very tight schedule. I needed to check the kitchen for anything I could use, but much to my frustration, all there was a single peach in the fridge. I'd barely managed to finish eating it when the first infected started hammering at the door, another going for the window. I was hoping the deputy with the gun would deal with the issue she caused as I went to restock my water supplies, but she didn't even bother. Sneaking into the bathroom with me, she now joined me, hiding out. We were trapped. Though my mind was screaming, I didn't rush. I washed myself down and made sure all my water canteens were full. There was no sense running right away. The door would hold for now. The sound of nearby shotgun shots giving me hope, and making me decide now was the time to leave. The deputy had gone catatonic. She just wasn't reacting to anything or defending herself. I had no pity for her at this point. She'd almost got me killed, and if she was just as good as bait, I was going to use her as that. To make sure she wouldn't follow, I told her not to and to stay back. That she responded to. Perhaps she'd just given up entirely. I wish she'd done it before she decided to break in here and take me with her. But any attempt at quick escape was dashed. Another survivor fighting for her life had brought a horde to my doorstep. Once again, I was having to suffer due to other people's mistakes. Now 2 zombies swarmed at me. I pushed my way back to the bathroom, letting them to be distracted by the cowering deputy as I chopped them down one by one. But I feared her cries would attract more, and it was only a temporary solution. If she was feeling better, or even able to move on, I would have perhaps stayed here for another night, resting once more. I was already tired from chopping down the zombies, but I couldn't stay here now. She'd just act as a lure. The blood, the sound, everything was a dinner bell to the infected. Stepping outside, it seemed like my choice was the wise one, There was a trio of survivors here, injured, low on ammo, and barely able to survive against the infected attacking them. They'd make a great distraction. Callous maybe, but they're the ones who were luring everyone to where my hiding place once was. Especially the one running after me. I had intended to go into the other houses, but with them following me and bringing the infected with them, it was just a horde on my heels. So I did my best to check what bodies I could along the way. Thankfully there was a wannabe hero nearby with a rifle, who was helping out those he could. There was a few survivors inside the high school itself as well. Plenty of infected would be coming this way due to those shots. I really needed a backpack. In a fight I struggled as I had to use axe one-handed, and my carrying capacity was limited. I clearly couldn't get the supplies I needed, and I'd hoped that, this being a school, there'd be one person with a rucksack. In hindsight, I should have gone into the school itself. In the confusion, I hadn't realised that several students had taken over sections of it, boarding up the windows. I was instead distracted by the zombies coming out of another classroom, smashing the windows on the outside, only to try and break back in again elsewhere, and then spotting me and chasing me. And, as typically would happen to my journey, when I went to try and help others, they would simply ignore me, leaving me to my fate. Now I had to deal with the problem with no backup. But my efforts were rewarded, with one of the infected having a backpack. Finally I could drop this damn handbag and be hands-free. Though I was now tired once again, and I would have to find somewhere to stay. I had no desire to head south. I'd heard alarms, but I was panicked, tired, and not sure what the hell I was doing. Noticing the local grocery store was boarded up by a now panicking survivor, that was my next port of call. I could get supplies here easily, and I doubt he was going to complain. But I was nearly blindsided by an infected. There were so many slain ones around here, I'd gotten sloppy. For once though, I got some assistance. Turns out this place was a holdout point for the locals, and they were patrolling around it. That would suit me fine. I needed some time to set things down and reorganise. It was about an hour and a half later when I was ready to move on. I wasn't going to go alone, however. That close encounter had humbled me quite a bit. With everything that had occurred, I was somewhat sick of my fellow man, feeling that I might have been better off alone. But, honestly, I could barely go for a few hours without getting tired and fatigued. I was constantly on the edge of my carrying capacity, and I was going to need companions no matter how much I was tired of the incompetence of others almost getting me killed. Firearms would be a plus, even though their noise would bring in the infected, but right then, with the overwhelming swarm closing in, it didn't really matter. I needed to get out as many people as I could. I'd already lost track of how long I'd been in town. Was it 2 days? Was it 3 now? Was it still just 1? I honestly didn't know, but all I knew was the evacuation wasn't going to hold on forever. I needed to keep moving, I needed to find people who would join me, and I would possibly need places to rest, due to my poor and ever-decreasing stamina. The alternative was finding transport, something I'd prefer, but it had its own set of issues. I'd have to be fortunate enough to find keys, and I didn't have time to be checking every body around an area, just in case. And even if I did find any, most of the cars that were usable were already gone, leaving only those with empty fuel tanks or more serious issues. So I set about gathering who I could, moving through the town. Though not everyone was willing to follow me, and also not everyone was in a position to. The fight against the infected was still fierce, especially amongst the more disorganised survivors. Whilst they could take down a straggler or two, if they took too long it would attract more of the infected, eventually leading to a horde and their deaths. Meanwhile, survivors were pairing up, or alternatively starting their own safe houses, and they could deal with stragglers very quickly, and were in a much safer position. Whilst it was amongst the more disorganised survivors I was trying to build my merry group, using the police uniform as a sign of authority, the other survivors would still be of use, They occasionally joined us for a time, wandering alongside us, and in my increasingly callous eyes, they were nothing more than meat shields for those who would follow me. Thankfully, the every man for himself attitude I was developing hadn't spread amongst the various survivors. With the infected roaming the street, they were more than happy to help other people, and this was much to my advantage, having a chance to move into one of the many safe houses. Many of the survivors within more than happy to join what seemed to be a police officer's attempt to evacuate the town. I wasn't going to correct them. I hadn't really intended to pretend to be an officer, but if it got me a chance to rest somewhere safe as the alarms blared outside, that I would use. After about an hour's rest, myself and a few other survivor groups started heading towards the river. With all the alarms going off in town, the infected were swarming in fast. So, if we wanted to bypass it all, following the river seemed like the safe bet. However, with the sheer amount of gunfire we had, we were still drawing in plenty of stragglers that planned to move towards the town. And it was really surprising just how many other survivors had thought of this plan too. We weren't really alone, and we had to be wary of just what they were doing. However, it did mean more recruits. My merry little band kept growing. There was quite a lot of us now. I hadn't got everyone's names, and I wasn't really sure what everyone was doing. However, it did worry me just how disorganized they were. They really didn't know what the hell they were doing most of the time. Though I was hardly any better, constantly tired, exhausted and stressed, I found myself, regardless, just becoming overconfident with the sheer amount of firepower my group possessed. My well-deserved cynicism constantly battling against my earlier optimism, which was starting to re-emerge. Budding heroics were coming back as I ran towards various action, trying to save who I could, when I could. I was telling myself I was just doing it so we'd have one more gun, one more person, someone between me and the infected, but honestly, I just wanted to save these people. If I only knew I was prolonging the inevitable. The further we went, the higher the number of infected. It was a bad sign, and the smaller groups that had rushed ahead of us were now getting picked off by these hordes one by one. I was trying to save who I could, when I could, but I simply couldn't keep up, and it was becoming increasingly dangerous for us. My small group was getting an impressive kill count, but every time I was worried if this would be the last of our ammo. Whilst we did have a lot of guns, their owners were more enthusiastic than accurate, and there was a lot of bad shots. But for now, we were unharmed, and hopefully we continue that way at least for a while. That was what was in my mind. When we reached the dock, there was no boat. I wasn't surprised, and I'm not that disappointed. It wouldn't have been big enough for our group anyway, but it still frayed at the edges of my mind. I was running on antidepressants and junk food at this point. I really needed a proper meal, but the stress and tiredness meant that I just needed to continue on, somewhere where we wouldn't be ambushed. And thankfully, we had another person join our happy little band, so it wasn't a complete loss. Though, no matter how much I wanted to deny it, we were on death march. There was no places to rest near here, without moving into the outskirts of town, where the infected would be thick and fast. We were already struggling with stragglers. With this many people in my group, sneaking really wasn't an option. But eventually, we were going to make it to the bridge, and there I could at least try and rest, even though my restless sleep was no good outside. I won't lie, I was genuinely tempted to try and nap in one of the many wrecked cars that littered the bridge, but if there was an infected near there, we'd be sitting ducks. A group this large couldn't maneuver quickly, and honestly, I was already barely able to carry what I could in my backpack. Even having eaten a few things, it was still far, far too close to my weight limit. But on the off chance there might be something useful, I had a look inside the big van. But I was disappointed. There was just a map of Riverside. I had no plans to return there anytime soon. I was under no misconceptions. With my constant exhaustion, I was having to eat and drink almost frequently. I was going through my supplies quickly. I had just enough to reach the evacuation zone. And if I was forced to wait there, or worse, I wouldn't have enough to leave. This was going to be dangerous if we didn't find supplies on the way. But chances for that were very scarce until we hit the trailer park town later. I had planned to follow the tracks, but the infected were already all over them. I didn't understand. I would have thought they'd be on the road, or still in the tree line. It's not like we could move through the brush. Our group was too big and too noisy, and the undergrowth was far too thick. We were exposed, and it was going to be a very long walk. About an hour later, more and more infected were popping up on the road. I was dead on my feet, barely awake, and I realised I'd underestimated the distance. We were going to have to take shortcuts if we wanted any chance of reaching one of the nearest houses, at least by the time it was nightfall, or even 1 or 2 a.m. At first it didn't seem so bad. Still deciding to avoid the forest, we moved across the grassland. We've only been infected here and infected there, alone or in a pair. But the further we moved north, the larger the hordes became. I really wasn't expecting these sizes until we reached the town, and it was making me very nervous. A stray gunshot could have us fleeing for our lives. We could find ourselves just sandwiched between whatever was lurking in the forest and the various people in front and behind. So, at that time, it was with a heavy heart I moved into the woods. The memories of what happened last time still fresh in my mind. And, as expected, they were infected. At the very least, if we shot one down here, we'd have a little time to run and move on. But, of course, my companions couldn't see a damn thing in front of them, so we had to play dodge the infected. I'm still a little frustrated thinking about it. Fighting the odd straggler should have been easy with so many of us, but instead it was a chore, barely dodging through the trees, having to do most of the risky work here and there, as the group were just incapable of thinking for themselves. And there it was, the gunshot that would cause us to start running. Exactly what I'd feared. The roads were swarming with infected, and we had to dart back into the woods. It was going to be chaos from here on out. I knew the river was nearby, and perhaps we could try our sneaking past, following it again. But that would mean we wouldn't be able to get to the buildings nearby. We needed supplies and we needed rest. Otherwise it was just an all-night march with low visibility, exhausted survivors, and an oncoming horde. With this in mind, we decided to make a quick stand in a clearing, wiping out as many of the infected as we could. Reloading was fast and frantic. We barely had enough time to keep up with the oncoming infected. It wasn't going to work. Even as we tried to kill the ones behind us, more were coming from in front. And with no end in sight, by the end of it, we simply had to run, as my companions started telling me they were running out of ammo. This was a bad sign. We hadn't even reached the town yet, and I can only imagine at the time things were going to get worse. And in hindsight they did. With so little cover between the clearing and the river, this meant the infected could follow us easily. I ordered everyone to change to melee weapons because I simply didn't trust them having enough time to reload. I really wish they hadn't all gathered together in a small group. I was really worried that a single infected could bump into them. They were already very panicked, and it would only take a small thing to break them, and the chaos we saw in Riverside would happen all over again. But if I have any regret, it's actually not stopping at that Riverside and facing that oncoming horde of infected. In the hours to come, it would become a complete nightmare that would run us down into the ground and affect everything we worked for so far.